In the last week of October, 1883, along the frozen bank of the Little Otter River, while most people were burning their debt notices in the stove and selling off their dead brother's possessions to pay what they could, Amelia Cross was doing one thing no one expected. She loaded a single trunk, her wool shawl, and a dog the color of dry prairie grass onto a handcart, and walked toward the toll bridge shack everyone else had abandoned as worthless. She meant to live there. Amelia Cross was 29 years old, unmarried, and as of 3 weeks ago she was also penniless. Her brother John had died owing more than the farm was worth, and the bank took everything: the house, the plow mule, even the iron stove. Everything except one asset no one wanted: a rotting toll bridge shack sitting on a lonely stretch of river that most travelers crossed for free at the shallows a half-mile south. The bridge was a joke. The ford was faster, easier, and cost nothing. Amelia moved into that shack not because she believed in it, but because it was the only roof the law couldn't take from her. She had a dog, a trunk, and a winter coming that would either finish her or make her the most powerful person in the entire valley. The river was about to decide. The Little Otter River ran low and stubborn through a valley that never gave anything away free. In good weather, the ford a half-mile south of the toll bridge was the obvious way to cross. It was wide, shallow, the bottom packed with gravel that wagons could roll across without even wetting their axles. No one needed a bridge when the river lay flat and lazy like a barn floor. John Cross had known that perfectly well. He had inherited the bridge from their father, who had built it on a speculation that never paid out. The charter allowed them to collect tolls, but the ford made the charter worthless. John spent 8 years trying to make the bridge matter. He painted the toll booth twice. He repaired the plank decking every spring after the ice gouged it. He even cut a new road leading to the approach, hopping to lure travelers from the ford. None of it worked. The ford was faster, and the toll was an annoyance people simply drove around. By the time John died of pneumonia in the autumn of 1883, he owed the Cedar County Trust $340, a sum roughly equal to 5 years of farm labor. The bank seized the farm, the livestock, and every piece of furniture in the house. But they paused at the toll bridge. It wasn't worth the paperwork. Nobody wanted a bridge nobody used. So Amelia Cross walked into it. The shack that stood beside the bridge approach was a low, single-room structure built from rough pine boards that had grayed to the color of old bone. The roof sagged above the north corner. The stovepipe was rusted through. The door hung crooked on its leather hinges. When Amelia arrived with her handcart, the dog sniffed the threshold and sneezed dust. It was not a home. It was a forgotten tool shed someone had once nailed a bed frame inside. But Amelia unpacked her trunk, set an iron pot on the cold stove plate, and swept the floor with a broom made from bound rye stalks. She nailed an old wool blanket across the worst draft. She told the dog, whose name was Cedar, to lie down beside the door. Then she walked out onto the bridge itself and stood at the center, looking down at the slow brown water moving beneath the planks. The bridge was solid enough. The stone piers her father had laid were still true. The timbers were weathered but unbroken. It could hold horses, wagons, even a small herd of cattle if anyone ever needed it to. The problem was never the bridge. The problem was November. In November, the river stayed open. The ford stayed passable, and Amelia Cross stayed invisible. 3 days after she moved in, the bank sent a man named Hollies. He arrived on a thin black horse, carrying a leather portfolio stuffed with notices. He stood on the approach road and called out that she was trespassing on seized property. Amelia came to the door and listened without speaking. Hollies explained that the bridge was legally the bank's asset now, and she had no right to occupy it. He gave her a piece of paper with a date. The auction would be held on December 3rd at the county courthouse. The bridge would be sold to the highest bidder, and the proceeds would go against her brother's debts. Until then, he said, she could stay if she wanted, but she would not collect a penny of tolls. She was nothing but a squatter. Amelia folded the paper and tucked it into her apron pocket. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just watched him ride away. Then she walked to the riverbank and started carrying stones. The stones were river-rounded, some big as a bread loaf, others smaller and easier to stack. She carried them one by one up to the bridge approach and began laying them around the base of the eastern pier. She worked in the cold wind, her wool shawl pulled tight, while travelers on the far bank glanced across and shook their heads. The ford was 20 yards downstream and they crossed there without paying her any mind. A few called out to her, asking why she was piling rocks against a bridge nobody crossed. She didn't answer. She kept stacking. Day after day, the low wall around the pier grew thicker and higher. She mixed mud and gravel to pack between the stones. She reinforced the wooden retaining beams that held the approach road in place. By the end of the first week, she had built a sloping apron of stone that would deflect ice away from the pier's foundation. She knew what happened to bridges in winter. Ice jams could lift a timber pier out of the ground like a tooth. She had seen her brother fight the same battle year after year, losing planks and sometimes whole sections to the spring breakup. She wasn't going to let that happen now. Not to her bridge. The town of Crow's Hollow sat 2 miles east, a cluster of 30 or so buildings huddled against the same wind that scoured the river valley. People there talked. They said Amelia Cross had lost her mind from grief. They said she was living in that shack like a wild woman, throwing rocks at a river that would flatten her bridge come spring. Some of the older men remembered her father and called him a fool, too. The toll bridge had always been a failure. It would always be a failure. The only sensible thing to do was let it rot and move on. A few women from the church sent bread out of pity, but no one sent hope, except one person. The old ferryman, a man named Thaddeus Meeks who had lost his livelihood when the ford became the preferred crossing, rode out to see her one afternoon. He didn't mock. He sat on his wagon and watched her stack stones for a long while. Then he said something quiet. "The ford don't freeze flat. It freezes rough." She asked him what he meant. He told her about the winter of '78, when an ice gorge formed a mile upstream and sent a surge of frozen slabs plowing through the shallows. 3 wagons got caught. 1 mule drowned. After that, people used the bridge for 2 months straight, and her father collected more tolls in one season than in 5 years combined. Then the thaw came, and everyone forgot again. Thaddeus looked at the gathering clouds above the northern ridge and said, "This winter feels the same." Then he handed her a coil of good rope and drove away. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time. Amelia woke before dawn to a sound she had not heard before, the river groaning. She lit the lantern and walked out onto the bridge in darkness. Below her, the water had thickened. Thin plates of ice drifted slowly through the current, scraping against the stone piers with a low, grinding hiss. The ford downstream was already catching the first sheets of ice, piling them in jagged ridges across the gravel. By sunrise, the ford looked like a half-broken puzzle. Water still ran beneath, but the edges were slick and uneven. Travelers who arrived that morning paused at the shallows, studying the ice, then turned back. Some cursed. Some simply waited, hoping the sun would soften the crossing. But the sun never touched the river bottom that day. The air stayed cold and pale, and the ice kept growing. Amelia watched from her shack window. She saw the first wagon turn back toward town. She saw a farmer on horseback try the ford anyway, the horse slipping badly on the slick stones until the rider finally dismounted and led it back to shore. By midday, no one had crossed. The Little Otter River, which had been a quiet thoroughfare for years, was becoming a barrier, and the only bridge across it for 10 miles in either direction was standing right beside her. She pulled on her shawl and walked to the center of the bridge, the same spot where she had stood her first day. The planks were dry. The approach was firm. The stone apron she had built around the eastern pier was already catching ice drift and pushing it sideways, away from the vulnerable timbers. She had done that. Not the bank, not the town, not the memory of her father. She had. And for the first time since her brother died, she felt something besides grief. She felt ready. 3 more days passed, and the ice hardened into a continuous crust across the entire river. The ford disappeared entirely beneath a jagged white sheet that groaned whenever pressure shifted. 2 separate travelers attempted to cross on foot that week, and both broke through to their knees, emerging soaked and shaking. The ford was no longer a crossing. It was a trap. On the morning of December 1st, with the auction just 2 days away, A freight wagon loaded with winter supplies for the settlement on the west bank arrived at the river's edge and stopped dead. The driver stared at the frozen chaos of the ford, then at the toll bridge standing intact nearby. He saw Amelia standing beside the toll gate, a wooden pole slung across the approach. He saw smoke rising from her shack chimney. He saw a dog the color of dry grass lying quietly beside the bridge rail. He shouted across the water, asking the toll. Amelia named her price. It was high, but not unreasonable, not compared to losing his load or his team. He paid. She lifted the pole, and his wagon rolled across the bridge for the first time in living memory. The sound of the planks thudding under the weight of his horses echoed down the valley like a bell. Amelia took the coins and walked back to the shack, her heart beating hard. She had done it. But in 2 days the bank would auction the bridge, and Hollies would be back with the sheriff. The river was freezing harder by the hour, and soon everyone would need her. The only question was whether she could hold on to the bridge long enough to make that matter. The next morning, December 2nd, Hollies returned. This time he was not alone. Beside him rode the county sheriff, a heavy man named Corliss who had spent 20 years collecting taxes and serving writs, and rarely said anything that couldn't be grunted. They arrived at the toll bridge just after dawn, while mist rose off the frozen river and the ice cracked in long groaning seams. Hollies dismounted and walked straight to the toll gate, where Amelia was already standing with Cedar beside her. He held up a fresh paper, the auction notice stamped and witnessed. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, the bridge would be sold on the courthouse steps. Until then, he informed her, she was forbidden from collecting a single coin more. The bridge was in custody of the court. Corliss would remain nearby to ensure compliance. The sheriff nodded once, then planted himself on a stump near the approach road, cold enough to need his coat collar up, patient enough to wait all day. Amelia said nothing. She walked back into the shack, poured water from a frozen bucket into the pot, and set it on the stove. Outside, the river groaned. The ford was now a mangled sculpture of pressure ridges and broken ice plates, impassable to any wheeled vehicle. Around mid-morning, a family of settlers appeared on the west bank, their wagon loaded with children, bedding, and a cage of chickens. They stared at the frozen river, then at the bridge. The man called across, asking who operated the crossing. Amelia stepped out. She looked at the sheriff, then at the family. She told them the toll was $1 for the wagon. The man hesitated. $1 was a full day's wages, but the ford was death. He paid. Amelia took the coin right in front of Corliss, who rose from his stump. His voice was low. That bridge is in custody. She answered without turning, the water is frozen. The court can't carry them across. I can. Corliss chewed the inside of his cheek but did not move to stop her. He was a practical man. The family crossed, the planks booming beneath the wheels, and Amelia dropped the silver dollar into a tin box beneath her bed. She had now collected 2 tolls in 2 days, more than the bridge had earned in the previous 2 years. Word traveled fast. By that afternoon, 5 more wagons had crossed, all paying. Farmers heading to the grain mill, a tinker with a load of tinware, a preacher traveling between settlements with his pregnant wife. Each time, Amelia stood at the gate, named her price, and each time they paid. The sheriff watched but took no action. He had no orders to stop passage, only to prevent the sale of the property before the auction. That legal gap, tiny as a needle's eye, was all Amelia needed. But Hollies, riding back in the late afternoon, saw the fresh wheel tracks in the frost on the approach road. He counted the crossings. He realized what was happening. His face tightened. He warned Corliss to do his duty. The sheriff shrugged. My duty is to keep the peace and make sure nobody shoots anyone over a bridge. I ain't stopping a woman from working. Holly spurred his horse toward town, furious. That night the temperature plunged further. The sky cleared to a hard black dome full of stars so sharp they seemed cut from glass. Amelia could hear the river continuing to freeze, the ice expanding against the banks with a sound like distant timber splintering. She sat by the stove with the tin box open on the table. She counted the coins, $11.40. In 2 days she had earned enough to buy a winter's worth of flour and beans. She could keep the stove burning for months. She could survive. But the auction was now just hours away, and no amount of tolls could stop the bank from taking the bridge unless she found a way to buy it herself, which would require more money than she could possibly collect by morning. She closed the box and stared at the stove glow. Cedar whined softly. She knew the bank would set a minimum bid. The bridge was legally worth more than she had, even if it had always been a financial failure. She had no allies, no legal standing, no husband to testify for her. She was a squatter with a strong back and a tin box full of coins that suddenly didn't feel like enough. She did not sleep. Instead, she dressed again in the dark and walked out onto the bridge. The ice had become a solid white road now, stretching upstream and down, glinting in the starlight. In the morning, the auctioneer would stand on the courthouse steps, and some land speculator from Cedar County would bid against another, and the bridge would belong to someone who had never touched a stone pier or reinforced a beam. She imagined Holly smiling. She imagined the new owner raising toll prices so high that even the desperate could not cross. She imagined the ford thawing in spring and everyone forgetting the bridge again. But then, standing there in the frozen dark, she remembered what Thaddeus Meeks had said. The ford don't freeze flat, it freezes rough. And this winter was already the roughest anyone in Crow's Hollow could remember. The ford would be closed for weeks, maybe months. Whoever controlled the bridge controlled the valley's only reliable crossing. The bank knew that. Holly's knew that. And now, watching her breath freeze in the still air, Amelia knew it too. She was not fighting for a shack and a pile of stones. She was fighting for a monopoly in the middle of a frozen world. The morning of December 3rd broke clear and bitter cold. The sun, pale as watered milk, threw no warmth at all. By 9 o'clock, a crowd had gathered outside the Cedar County courthouse. The auctioneer, a lean man with a rasping voice, set up his box on the top step. Holly stood nearby with a folded directive from the bank, his thin black horse tethered to the rail. Several speculators had arrived, including a man named Underwood who owned riverfront lots in 3 counties and rarely lost a bid. He wore a heavy beaver coat and smelled of cigar smoke. The crowd murmured. Amelia Cross walked into town alone, her shawl pulled tight, the tin box hidden under her arm. Cedar padded beside her. She had no lawyer, no representative, only herself. She found a place at the edge of the gathering and waited. The auctioneer began. He read the description of the property: a toll bridge crossing the Little Otter River with appurtenances, charters, and rights of collection, situated on the county turnpike. Bidding started at $100. Underwood immediately raised a finger. A second man, a dairy farmer from the east, bid $120. Underwood bid $150. The numbers climbed slowly while Hollis watched Amelia from across the crowd. She did not raise her hand. She was waiting. At $240, the dairy farmer dropped out. Underwood adjusted his coat. The auctioneer called for final bids. Amelia opened the tin box and stepped forward. She spoke clearly. She bid $241, every coin she had. The crowd stirred. Underwood looked at her, this woman in a shawl with a dog and a box of change. He laughed once, then bid $260. Amelia's face went pale. She had no more. The auctioneer repeated the higher bid. Then a voice from the back of the crowd spoke. $270. Everyone turned. It was Thaddeus Meeks, the old ferryman. He held a leather purse in his gloved hand. He looked at Amelia and nodded. Not charity, he said. Investment. Underwood scowled and bid again, $290. Meeks countered with $300. The numbers bounced higher, but now the speculator was no longer bidding against a lone woman with a tin box. He was bidding against a man who knew the river better than anyone alive and who had saved money for 20 years waiting for the river to turn mean again. At $380, Underwood stepped back, his face sour as old cider. Going once, going twice, sold. The auctioneer's hammer struck. The toll bridge now belonged to Thaddeus Meeks. And without a word, Meeks handed Amelia the deed papers. He didn't want the bridge. He wanted the right person running it. He looked at Hollis, then at Underwood, then back at Amelia. Pay me back when the thaw comes, he said. Or don't, just keep the poor crossing. Then he walked away through the cold, his boots printing deep in the frozen mud. Amelia held the deed in her bare hand, the paper stiffer than old leather. She had no words. Hollis stared at her, his mouth a thin line. The bank had lost. The auction had not gone the way any of them expected, but Amelia knew the fight was not over. It was merely different now. She had the bridge legally, but she also had enemies who would not forget, and the winter was just beginning to show its teeth. That afternoon, she returned to the bridge to find a line of wagons waiting on the west bank. Word of the auction had preceded her. People now knew she was the rightful owner, and they came in numbers she had never seen. She lifted the toll gate and began crossing them one by one. The coins filled the tin box past its previous limit. But amid the line she noticed a cart that did not belong. A thin woman with two small children and a bundle of possessions tied with rope, their faces hollow from hunger. They were refugees from a failed homestead to the north, their cabin burned, their bread gone. They had no money. Amelia stood still. The rules of toll bridges were simple, pay or don't cross. But the meek's words echoed in her head. Keep the poor crossing. She looked at the children. She thought of her own brother dying with nothing. She lowered the toll pole and waved them through without payment. That was the first free crossing. It would not be the last. Within days, the story spread that Amelia Cross had let a starving family pass without a coin. In the taverns and churchyards, people talked. Some called her foolish, some called her soft, but others, the ones who remembered her brother's debts and the bank's cold greed, started to wonder. What would happen when the bank tried again? Because Hollies had not given up. He was already riding back to Cedar County to file a new motion, arguing the auction was improperly conducted, that the bridge rightfully belonged to the trust. And this time, he intended to bring a judge. Hollies returned 3 days later with a judge, not the county magistrate who handled petty theft and fence disputes, but a circuit judge named Harlan Crosswaite, a man with deep ties to Eastern banking families and a reputation for ruling in favor of creditors. He traveled in a covered carriage that jingled with brass fittings, and he brought along a clerk with a portable writing desk. They arrived at the toll bridge at noon while a line of 5 wagons was waiting to cross. Hollies pointed at Amelia, standing at the toll gate with her pole, collecting coins as if she had every right. That woman, he said to the judge, is operating a seized asset in defiance of a court order. The judge stepped down from the carriage and studied the scene. The frozen river, the stone piers, the small shack with smoke spiraling straight upward. Then he walked to the approach and called out for Amelia Cross. She came forward, the tin box in one hand, the toll pole in the other. Cedar growled low but stayed at her heel. The judge informed her that the bank had filed a motion to void the auction on the grounds that Thaddeus Meeks acted as an unlicensed bidder and that the sale was conducted under duress from local interference. He had the authority to place the bridge into receivership immediately, pending a full hearing in Cedar County. Amelia listened without interrupting. Then she asked one question: "Who feeds my dog if you take the bridge?" The judge blinked. The question was not legal, but it stuck. She continued. She told him about the family who had crossed without a penny, the children who had been too weak to walk. She told him that the bank had never done a thing for the people of this valley except take from them. And now, when the river had frozen into the only road that still worked, the bank wanted to take the tolls too. Hollies began to argue, but the judge raised a hand. He looked at the line of wagons. He asked the drivers who they trusted to run this crossing. One by one, the farmers and traders spoke. Not one mentioned the bank. They all named Amelia. The judge studied the ice on the river, the way the ford was a white graveyard, the way the bridge deck was the only solid ground between the two banks. Then he said something that surprised everyone. He said the law was clear, but so was the necessity. He could not void a sale that had already been paid for and recorded without a full hearing, which could not happen for at least 6 weeks due to his circuit schedule. Until then, he would issue no order of removal. He advised Hollies to file a civil suit and left the bridge standing. Hollies rode away silent, his thin black horse slipping on the frozen ruts, while Amelia stood at the gate with the deed still in her pocket and the toll box full. That was the legal victory, but it was not the last threat. The bank, embarrassed, began a campaign of rumor. Hollies told the freight companies that the bridge was unsafe, that the piers were cracked, that the deck could give way under heavy loads. He spread word that Amelia had no insurance, that if a wagon fell through, the driver's family would get nothing. For a few days, the traffic slowed. Travelers hesitated. Even some who had crossed before started eyeing the bridge with suspicion. Amelia knew she could not fight a rumor with a toll pole. She needed proof. So she did something no one expected. She invited a county engineer to inspect the bridge at her own expense. She used $4 from the tin box, a sum that hurt, to pay for the man's travel. He came, a quiet Dutchman named Visser, and spent an entire morning tapping every beam, measuring every pier, dropping a weighted line into the ice-fringed water to check the stone footings. When he finished, he wrote a certificate of soundness and nailed it to the toll gate. The bridge, he declared, was one of the sturdiest private crossings in the county. The rumors died faster than a wet fire. Traffic surged. Tolls poured in. Amelia counted the coins each night by lantern light, and the total climbed past $80, then past $120. She paid Thaddeus Meeks the first installment of his loan, and he refused to take interest. She bought a new stovepipe, a sack of sugar, a bolt of wool cloth. But more importantly, she started something she had no name for at first. Every time a family came through with thin coats and hollow cheeks, she waved them across without payment. No questions, no speeches. Just a nod, and the pole lifted. Sometimes the poor travelers offered a chicken or a sack of beans instead of coin. She took what they could give and never refused a crossing. The word of this spread farther than any rumor the bank could conjure. The poor began calling it the Mercy Bridge. And that name, more than any legal ruling, became the thing the bank could not fight. One afternoon, a man named Laughlin arrived at the bridge with a wagon full of grain sacks. He was a widower with 5 children, known for hard luck and harder work. He had no coin, only a piglet wrapped in burlap. He offered the pig in exchange for passage. Amelia looked at the pig, at the children huddled in the wagon, at the ice stretching upstream, and she told him to keep the pig. His children needed it more than she did. Laughlin stared at her for a long moment, his wind-burned face unreadable. Then he said, "The bank ever comes again, you call for me." He crossed, and after that, the bridge was never just a bridge. It was a debt of gratitude spread across half the valley, and the bank was about to discover exactly how expensive that debt could be. By mid-January, the winter had turned savage. The cold deepened until even the toughest farmers stopped working outdoors by mid-afternoon. The ice on the river thickened to over a foot, and the ford remained a jagged hazard that broke wagon axles and crippled horses. The bridge was the only safe crossing for nearly 15 miles in both directions, and everyone knew it. Amelia's toll box grew heavy. She began keeping accounts in a ledger book she bought from the dry goods store, writing each transaction in careful script. The numbers told a story the bank had never predicted. The bridge, once worthless, was now generating more income in a single week than the entire Cross Farm had earned in a season. And every time Amelia forgave a toll for someone who could not pay, she was not losing money. She was investing in something deeper. Hollis, back at the Cedar County Trust, watched the reports with growing fury. The bridge was producing, but not for the bank. The loan he had expected to recover was slipping further away because the asset had been legally sold at auction. His superiors demanded action. He tried a new tactic. He filed a lien against the bridge, claiming that the original debt was attached to the land and could not be extinguished by sale. He hired a marshal to deliver the lien papers directly to Amelia. The marshal, a young man named Perry, arrived at the bridge on a gray horse with a pistol on his hip and a folded document sealed with red wax. He rode up to the toll gate and demanded that Amelia Cross accept service. She took the papers, read them slowly, and then did something that would become legend in Crow's Hollow. She opened the stove door in the shack and dropped the lien into the fire. Then she turned back to the marshal and said, "I don't owe that bank anything. The fire does." The marshal did not know what to do. He looked at the woman, at the dog, at the stone pier reinforcements, at the line of wagons waiting to cross, and he decided that arresting a woman in front of 24 witnesses for burning a piece of paper would start a war he was not prepared to fight. He tipped his hat and rode away. That night, the story passed from cabin to cabin. The woman had burned the bank's lien. The bank had been defied, and somewhere in the cold dark, a loyalty was forged that no legal document could undo. The final attempt came in early February. The bank, desperate, sent not a marshal but a crew of hired men. They were 5 rough laborers from the lumber camps north of the county, paid in cash and whiskey, told to take possession of the bridge by force if necessary. They arrived at dusk with crowbars and an old shotgun, planning to barricade the approach and run the crossing themselves under the bank's name. But they had underestimated one thing: not Amelia's strength, though she had plenty. Not the dog, though Cedar would have fought. They had underestimated the people. Someone saw them coming. A boy fishing through a hole in the ice spotted the men on the trail and ran to the nearest farm. By the time the hired crew reached the bridge, lanterns were already moving across the darkened valley. Men came on foot with axes and fence posts. Women came with pitchforks and lanterns. Laughlin was there, the widower whose children had crossed for nothing. Thaddeus Meeks arrived with a heavy oar and stood beside the gate. Within an hour, nearly 40 people surrounded the bridge. The hired men looked at the crowd, at the grim faces, at the tools that could become weapons, and they made the only smart decision available to them. They left. The bank never sent anyone again. But the real turning point was not the confrontation. It was what happened the next morning. The crowd had dispersed, and the bridge was quiet, and Amelia stood alone at the center span watching a pale sun rise over the ice. She realized that she had never asked for help. She had simply given it, over and over, to people who could not pay. And now those people had given her back something the bank could never buy: an army of neighbors who had decided that this bridge belonged not to a trust or a deed, but to the woman who had let them cross when they had nothing. The strategy had not been planned. It had grown naturally from the same cold river that froze the ford, and it had worked better than any legal defense she could have mounted. The bridge was safe, not because of a paper, but because of people. The winter still had weeks to go, and the river would not thaw until late March. But Amelia Cross was no longer just a woman surviving in a shack. She was the keeper of the crossing that held the valley together, and the bank had finally learned the lesson John Cross never did. A bridge is not made valuable by its planks. It is made valuable by the people who need it, and by the person they trust to run it. The thaw would come, and with it, a final reckoning. The thaw came late that year, not with a sudden break, but with a long, groaning surrender. For days the ice on the Little Otter River cracked and shifted, slabs riding over slabs, the sound like distant cannon fire rolling through the valley. The ford remained a death trap longer than anyone expected, choked with grinding plates that would have crushed a wagon or a horse. The bridge stayed open. Every morning Amelia cleared the approach of drifted snow and checked the stone piers for ice damage. The tolls continued to flow. By the time the first open water appeared near the banks, she had paid Thaddeus Meeks nearly half of what she owed him, and the tin box held enough to see her through spring planting if she ever got land to plant. But the true reckoning was not the rivers. It was the courts. On the 15th of March, with patches of bare mud beginning to show through the snow on the south-facing hills, the Circuit Judge Harlan Crosswaite returned to Cedar County. The hearing was set in the same courthouse where the auction had been held, in a room that smelled of wet wool and stove smoke. Holly sat at the front with a lawyer from the bank's home office, a narrow man named Finch who carried a leather case full of precedents. Amelia came alone, the deed folded in her pocket, Cedar waiting outside the courthouse door. The judge had allowed her to speak for herself after she told him she could not afford an attorney and would not ask Meeks for more money. She had asked only one thing: that the people who used the bridge be allowed to testify. The judge, curious or perhaps tired of Finch's objections, had agreed. The first witness was Laughlin, the widower. He walked to the front in a coat still patched from the winter, his hands scarred from frost. He told the court that his children would have frozen on the west bank if Amelia had not let them cross without payment. When Finch asked if he had ever paid her back, Laughlin said he had given her a piglet and that she had refused it. Then came others: the woman whose homestead had burned, carrying one of the children who had crossed that day; the tinker who had paid his toll and later brought her a stovepipe at cost; the farmer whose wagon had been the first to cross after the sale. Each one said the same thing in different words. She took no more than was fair, and she let the poor cross when they had nothing. The bridge was not a business, they said. It was a mercy. Finch argued that the auction was crooked, that Meeks had bid only to circumvent the bank's claim that the bridge was still encumbered by the original debt attached to John Cross's estate. He waved the lien papers, the ones Amelia had burned, but he had copies. The judge listened with his chin resting on his hand. Then Amelia spoke. She did not argue law. She told the judge what the bridge had been when she walked into it: a rotting shack, a joke, a thing the bank had not wanted until it began to earn. She described the stones she had carried, the pier she had reinforced, the winter nights she had stayed awake listening to the ice test her work. She said the bank had seized her brother's farm, his plow mule, his stove, and had left nothing but the one building they considered worthless. Only now, because she had made it worth something, they wanted it back. She asked the judge one question. If a woman pours her life into a thing the world threw away, does the world get to take it the moment it becomes valuable? The room stayed quiet for a long time. Judge Crosswaite closed his eyes, and then he spoke. He said the auction had been conducted legally, and that the deed was valid. He said the lien was extinguished because the bank had failed to record it against the property before the sale, a technical truth Finch had hoped no one would notice. He said the debt of John Cross was satisfied when the bank seized the farm, because the farm alone was worth more than the outstanding balance, a fact the bank had neglected to mention. And then he said something no one expected. The bank, by refusing to maintain the bridge and then attempting to seize it after the fact, had acted in bad faith. He dismissed the suit with prejudice and ordered the bank to pay court costs. The gavel fell. Hollis did not look at Amelia. He walked out into the mud, and his thin black horse carried him away from the valley for the last time. The crowd spilled out into the pale afternoon light, and someone laughed, and someone else shook Amelia's hand so hard her knuckles cracked. She thanked them, but she kept looking toward the river. The real verdict was waiting there. 2 weeks later, the ice was completely gone. The river ran high with meltwater, brown and muscular, and the ford re-emerged from beneath its winter coat. But it was not the same ford. The ice jams that had tortured the shallows all winter had done more than block passage. They had scoured the gravel bottom, gouging out deep troughs where the current had once spread thin and easy. The old crossing, the place where wagons had rolled across for generations without wetting their axles, was now a waist-deep channel running fast as a mill race. Horses balked. Wagons tilted dangerously. 2 separate travelers attempted the ford in the first warm week and both nearly lost their loads. By April, it was clear to everyone. The ford was dead. The Little Otter River had changed its mind, and the only safe crossing on 40 miles of water was the toll bridge Amelia Cross had rebuilt with her own hands. She did not raise her prices. She kept a ledger and noted each crossing, and the tin box grew heavier, but the rule she had made in the frozen dark remained. If a traveler could not pay, she lifted the pole anyway. The poor remembered. The valley remembered. And when word traveled out that the only reliable bridge across the Little Otter was run by a woman who asked only what you could give, new settlers began choosing the West Bank because they knew they could reach the east. The bridge became the spine of the region, and the woman who held it became something more than a toll keeper. She became the gate through which the valley prospered. By midsummer, Amelia had paid Thaddeus Meeks every dollar of his loan plus a share of the season's profits that he tried to refuse, and she forced him to take. She enlarged the shack, adding a second room and a proper door on iron hinges. She bought a milk cow and pastured it on the bank where the old ford approach had worn a bare patch in the grass. Cedar grew fat on table scraps and lay at her feet each evening while she balanced her books. The bridge itself, strengthened by the stone work she had done in desperation, withstood the spring floods without losing a single plank. The engineer Visser came back unasked and pronounced it fit for another 50 years. Hollis never returned. The Cedar County Trust, embarrassed by the court loss and the dry cough of public scorn, closed its branch in Crow's Hollow within the year. The bigger speculators, men like Underwood, stayed on their own side of the county and told themselves the bridge was a small thing, a women's victory not worth the trouble. But the truth was simpler and sharper. They had been outmatched by someone who understood something they never would. The bridge was not a financial instrument. It was a bond between people, and the bond had held. As the first autumn after the great freeze settled over the valley, Amelia stood on the center span in the same spot she had stood on her first day, watching the river flow beneath her. The planks were dry. The stone piers held true. The water that had once frozen into her only hope now ran quiet and obedient under the arches. She remembered the voices that had called her a fool, the bank that had tried to crush her, the winter that had nearly killed her and instead gave her everything. She had been given debts, a shack, and a frozen river. She had turned them into a home, a crossing, and a promise. The ford was gone, the bridge remained, and the river, which had once threatened to destroy her, now simply carried the current past as if it had always meant to serve her. A new winter was gathering above the northern ridge. But this time, Amelia Cross was not afraid of what the cold would bring. She had already taught the river who owned the crossing. The valley would not forget. The story of Amelia Cross does not end with a fortune or a monument. It ends with a quiet truth that the frontier whispered but rarely spoke aloud. Value is never fixed. It shifts with the weather, with need, with the strange alchemy that turns a frozen river into a road and a forgotten shack into the heart of a valley. The bank saw a worthless asset. Holly saw a liability. Underwood saw a speculation. Amelia saw a roof she could not be evicted from, and then she saw something more. She saw that the bridge was not really about the planks. It was about who needed to cross them. And in that recognition, she found a power that no lien or lawsuit could touch. The winter of 1883 tested everyone. It broke the ford, buried homesteads, and drove families to the edge of survival. But it also exposed the brittle logic of those who measured value only in coin. The bank had every legal advantage. They had papers, lawyers, a judge in their pocket, and hired men with crowbars. And they still lost. They lost because they never understood the asset they were fighting for. A bridge is not a thing you own. It is a thing people trust. Trust cannot be seized. Amelia's mercy at the toll gate was not charity in the soft sense. It was an investment in loyalty that paid out at the moment she needed it most. When the hired crew arrived, 40 people stood in the dark with axes and pitchforks, not because they were paid, but because she had carried their children across the ice for nothing. That was her real ledger, not the tin box, but the debt of gratitude she had built one wave toll at a time. It was the only currency the bank could not counterfeit. The thaw came, as it always does, and the river changed its mind. The ford that had served generations vanished in a season, gouged out by the same ice that had frozen it. And the bridge, the unwanted joke, became the permanent spine of a growing region. That was not luck. That was the consequence of holding on long enough for the world to shift beneath you. If the ford had stayed shallow and easy, the bridge might have faded again. But the river did not cooperate with the easy story. It gave the crossing to the person who had built stone walls around its piers while everyone else was shaking their heads. Amelia Cross outlasted the bank, outworked the speculators, and outloved the winter. She did not defeat nature. She studied it, braced for it, and let it do the work of clearing her competition. The river froze, and she was ready. The ice jam destroyed the ford, and she had already rebuilt the bridge. She did not force the valley to choose her. She simply made sure she was the only choice worth making. Now the question that lingers is not whether she was smart or strong. It is whether any of it would have worked if she had chosen to be cruel. If she had charged full tolls to every starving family, would the crowd have gathered that night? Would Laughlin have raised a fence post in her defense? Would Thaddeus Meeks have bid his life savings on a woman who only took? The answer sits at the bottom of that frozen river like a stone worn smooth by the current. Her mercy was not separate from her survival. It was the engine of it. In a world that often tells us to hold tight to what we have, Amelia Cross opened her hand and let the poor through. And the poor became her army. The river became her ally. The bridge that was meant to bury her in debt became the thing that set her free. She did not wait for permission. She did not argue with men who would never understand. She simply stacked stones, kept a tin box, and trusted that the winter would do what winters always do, reveal who was truly prepared. So we leave you with this. Was Amelia Cross a genius of frontier strategy, or was she simply one of the few people willing to see a frozen river not as a disaster, but as an invitation? Did she shape the winter, or did the winter shape her? And if you had been standing at that toll gate with a tin box and a dog the color of dry grass, would you have lifted the pole? Subscribe now to witness more stories of those who turned winter's cruelty into their greatest weapon. The cold has a way of revealing the truth. Don't look away.